I never intended to shut down a construction project worth tens of millions of dollars. Honestly, all I wanted was to keep a patch of grass that already belonged to me. Funny how sometimes the biggest fights in your life start with something so small that nobody else would even notice it. My name is Caleb Turner, and for nearly 12 years I'd lived in a quiet neighborhood just outside Cedar Ridge, Ohio. Nothing special about the place. No gated entrances, no fancy landscaping, no homeowners association breathing down your neck. Just regular people trying to live regular lives. The kind of neighborhood where folks wave from their pickup trucks and actually mean it. My house sat on a corner lot, a modest one-story ranch with faded blue shutters and a wide stretch of open land along the east side. Most people would have built a shed there or park an RV. I never did. I liked the space. It gave the house room to breathe. My wife used to joke that I treated that side yard like it was a national park. Maybe she wasn't wrong. Every Saturday morning I'd mow it, edge it, water it if the summer got too dry. There was something peaceful about looking out my kitchen window and seeing open green grass instead of another structure crammed against the property line. For years, the lot next door sat abandoned. Just weeds, dirt, the occasional soda can blowing through. Then one spring, everything changed. A development company called Summit Crest Holdings bought the property. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. Then the survey crew showed up. Then the engineers. Then the trucks. Within 2 weeks, the empty lot looked like a military operation. Temporary offices, portable fencing, permit signs, heavy equipment, workers everywhere. One of my neighbors, old Mr. Hanley from across the street, stood beside me one morning watching excavators roll in. He shook his head and said, "That place is going to be apartments." I laughed. No chance. Lot's too small. Turns out I was wrong. Very wrong. The company planned to build a cluster of luxury rental townhomes. Tight spacing, modern design, the kind of place that looks incredible in a brochure and somehow feels smaller once you're actually standing inside. Still, it wasn't my project, not my business. Construction is construction. You put up with some noise, some dust, and eventually life goes back to normal. At least that's what I thought. One evening after work, I pulled into my driveway just as the sun was dropping behind the trees. The whole neighborhood was glowing orange. It should have been one of those peaceful moments people post online with captions about gratitude. Instead, I noticed something strange. A stack of lumber, right near the edge of my side yard. Not huge, just enough to catch my attention. I stared at it for a few seconds, then shrugged. Maybe a delivery driver made a mistake. It happens. The next morning, I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and nearly dropped it. The lumber was still there. And now there was more. Steel framing, wrapped insulation, several pallets of bricks. I stood there blinking like maybe I hadn't fully woken up yet. Then I heard the sound. Beep, beep, beep. A forklift backed up across my grass. My grass. Not the construction site. Not the vacant lot. Mine. The driver didn't hesitate. Didn't slow down. Didn't even look concerned. He drove across my property like he'd done it 100 times before. That's when the little voice in my head stopped saying maybe. Maybe became definitely. Definitely became problem. I walked toward the site, trying to stay calm. Because here's something I've learned over the years. The first conversation usually determines how the rest of the story goes. You can either solve a misunderstanding or start a war. I was still hoping for misunderstanding. I found a worker unloading materials from a truck. "Hey, who's running things around here?" He pointed toward a man wearing a white hard hat near one of the trailers. Clipboard in one hand. Radio clipped to his vest. The universal look of somebody who believes he's important. I walked over, introduced myself, then said, "Hey, I think some of your materials ended up on my property." The man glanced in the general direction of my yard. Barely. Then looked back at his clipboard. "Yeah, temporary situation." That was his entire answer. Temporary situation. Like he'd practiced saying it. I nodded. "Okay, but it's still my property." He finally looked up, for maybe 2 seconds, then gave me a smile that wasn't really a smile. "You sure about the property line?" he asked. Those boundaries aren't always exact. Something about the way he said it hit me wrong. Not rude. Not aggressive. Worse. Dismissive. Like he'd already decided I didn't know what I was talking about. I looked back toward the stacks of lumber sitting on my grass. Then back at him. And in that moment, I realized something that would change everything. This wasn't an accident. Because people who make honest mistakes usually apologize. People who know exactly what they're doing start questioning your facts. And standing there in the middle of that noisy construction site, watching forklifts move behind him and hearing trucks rumble across the dirt, I got the uncomfortable feeling that this guy wasn't worried about whether he was right. He was betting that I wouldn't bother proving he was wrong. And unfortunately for him, I had a lot more patience than he did. That night, I dug through a filing cabinet in my garage that I hadn't opened in years. Most people shove their property records into a folder after closing on a house and never look at them again. I almost did the same thing. But around 10 o'clock, sitting in my workbench under a single fluorescent light, I found exactly what I was looking for. The original survey. Certified. Stamped. Detailed down to the inch. I spread the papers across the table and started measuring. Then I measured again. And again. By midnight, I wasn't guessing anymore. The materials weren't near my property. They weren't accidentally crossing the line. There were several feet inside it. The next morning, I stopped by a hardware store before work and bought bright orange survey stakes. After dinner, I walked out and placed them carefully along the property boundary. Every marker was visible. Every marker was obvious. You would have had to actively try not to see them. I remember standing there afterward feeling oddly satisfied. Not because I wanted to fight, because I thought maybe this would solve it. Maybe somebody would see the markers and realize they had crossed the line. Maybe we'd all move on. That lasted less than 24 hours. The following afternoon, I came home and discovered they'd shifted some of the materials. Maybe a foot, 2 feet at most. Just enough to technically acknowledge the markers while continuing to use my property. It was almost impressive, like watching somebody follow the exact wording of a rule while deliberately violating the spirit of it. The forklifts kept coming. The deliveries kept arriving. And every day the damage got worse. The grass started disappearing beneath tire tracks. The soil became packed hard from repeated traffic. Plastic wrapping blew across the yard. Wood scraps appeared in places I'd never seen them before. One evening, my neighbor, Sarah Whitmore, walked over while I was picking debris out of the grass. She looked toward the construction site and asked, "They're still doing it?" "Every day." "You call anybody yet?" I shook my head. "Not yet." She stared at me for a second, then smiled. "That's usually when you're most dangerous." I laughed, because she wasn't entirely wrong. See, I've never been the guy who explodes. Never been the guy who screams across fences. My father taught me something years ago. He used to say, anger feels powerful for about 5 minutes. Evidence lasts forever. At the time, I thought it was one of those old man sayings. Turns out, it was one of the most useful lessons he ever gave me. So instead of arguing, I started documenting. Every morning before work. Photos. Every evening after work. Videos. I recorded forklifts crossing the boundary markers. Workers unloading materials. Tire tracks. Damage. Everything. At first it felt ridiculous. Like I was conducting some kind of private investigation over a patch of grass. But after a week, the pattern became impossible to ignore. And that's important, because one mistake can always be explained away. A pattern is much harder to defend. The more evidence I collected, the more I started understanding what was really happening. This wasn't personal. The supervisor didn't hate me. The company wasn't targeting me. Honestly, I doubt they thought about me much at all. To them, I was simply an obstacle, a small inconvenience standing between them and their deadlines. And deadlines in construction are expensive. Every day costs money. Every delay costs money. Every schedule change costs money. So when companies find shortcut, some of them convince themselves the shortcut isn't really a problem, especially if nobody pushes back. That's the part most people miss. These situations rarely begin with somebody saying, "Let's break the rules." They begin with somebody saying, "Nobody's going to care." And once that mindset takes hold, the line keeps moving. A few days later, I decided it was time to find out exactly what rules they were supposed to be following. So I drove downtown to the county permit office. Now, if you've never visited one of those places, imagine a building where excitement goes to die. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, stacks of paperwork everywhere. The woman behind the counter looked like she'd spent 20 years dealing with angry contractors and confused homeowners, which meant she was probably impossible to impress. I gave her the project address. She asked what I needed. I said, "I'd like to review the approved site plans." She raised an eyebrow. Most people don't ask for that. Then she disappeared into the back. About 15 minutes later, she returned carrying a thick folder. I sat down at one of the tables and started reading. The deeper I got, the more interesting things became. Every detail of the project had been mapped out. Construction limits, equipment access, material storage, temporary fencing, everything. The county hadn't just approved a building. They had approved a specific process, a specific footprint, a specific set of rules. Then I found a section that changed everything. I still remember reading it. I actually stopped and read it twice. The language was simple. All material storage and equipment operations must remain within designated construction boundaries. Unauthorized use of adjacent private property may result in enforcement actions, including suspension of work activities. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time since this started, I smiled. A real smile. Because suddenly this wasn't a disagreement. It wasn't a debate. It wasn't even a property line dispute. It was a permit violation. And permit violations have consequences. The county doesn't care about feelings. The county cares about compliance. I spent the next 2 days organizing everything. Photos, videos, dates, times, survey records, property maps. I put together a package so clean and straightforward that nobody would have to interpret anything. The evidence spoke for itself. Then I filed a formal complaint. No emotional language. No dramatic accusations. No angry letters. Just facts. Repeated, unauthorized use of private property. Material storage beyond approved construction limits. Documented damage. Supporting evidence attached. That was it. I submitted everything and went home. Then I waited. 3 days passed. Nothing happened. For days. Nothing. 5 days. Still nothing. The construction site continued operating like normal. Forklifts moving. Workers building. Deliveries arriving. For a moment, I wondered if I'd wasted my time. Maybe the complaint got buried. Maybe nobody cared. Maybe the system worked slower than I expected. Then on the 6th morning, I walked outside, carrying my coffee, and immediately noticed something different. 2 county vehicles were parked near the entrance. Not contractor trucks. Not company SUVs. County vehicles. And the moment I saw them, I knew. Because construction sites have a certain rhythm. A certain confidence. That confidence was gone. Workers stood around watching. Supervisors moved quickly from place to place. Radios crackled constantly. Nobody looked relaxed. The inspectors spent nearly an hour measuring boundaries and reviewing plans. Then they started walking directly toward my side yard, toward the lumber, toward the steel, toward the forklift tracks pressed deep into the ground. I stayed on my porch. I didn't wave. I didn't interrupt. I just watched. One inspector stopped beside one of my orange survey stakes. He looked down, checked his paperwork, measured again, then called the second inspector over. They took photographs. Lots of photographs. They measured multiple points, compared notes, and eventually they called over the site supervisor. The same guy, the same white hard hat, the same clipboard, the same man who told me the property line wasn't exact. From where I stood, I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could read body language. And body language tells the truth long before words do. His shoulders tightened. His arms crossed, then uncrossed. At one point, he pointed toward the site, then toward my property, then back toward the inspectors. The inspectors didn't look impressed, not even a little. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I had the distinct feeling that somebody else was finally asking him the questions he'd been avoiding. About an hour later, the noise stopped. Not slowed down. Stopped. The forklifts shut off. The deliveries paused. The workers gathered in small groups. And near the entrance of the site, an official notice was posted where everybody could see it. I couldn't read the entire document from my porch, but I didn't need to. The bold letters at the top were visible from half a block away. Stop work order. And just like that, the project that had ignored my property for weeks suddenly had a much bigger problem than me. The strange thing about winning a fight is that sometimes it doesn't feel like winning right away. When I saw that stop work order hanging on the fence, I didn't jump up and celebrate. I didn't call my neighbors. I didn't stand at the property line grinning like some movie villain. Honestly, I just stood there holding a half-finished cup of coffee, staring at a construction site that had suddenly gone silent. And silence is a powerful thing when you've been listening to noise for weeks. No backup alarms. No dieselengians. No shouting crews. Nothing. Just wind moving through the trees. For the first time in a long while, my neighborhood sounded like itself again. Around 6 that evening, there was a knock at my front door. I already knew who it was before I opened it. People don't spend millions on development projects without eventually sending someone to negotiate. Standing on my porch was a man I'd never seen before. Clean jeans, button-down shirt, expensive watch. The kind of person who spends more time in meetings than on construction sites. He introduced himself as Nathan Cole, Regional Project Manager, which basically meant he was high enough up the ladder that the company suddenly cared what he thought. He extended his hand. I shook it. Then he gave me one of those practiced professional smiles. The kind that looks friendly until you realize it's mostly corporate damage control. "Mr. Turner," he said, "I think we got off on the wrong foot." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because that sentence shows up whenever somebody finally realizes they're losing. Nathan spent the next few minutes explaining how unfortunate the situation was, how communication had broken down, how certain decisions had been made in the field, how nobody intended for things to escalate. The words were polished, carefully selected, probably rehearsed during the drive over. Then he finally arrived at the reason he was standing on my porch. "We'd like to resolve this immediately." Of course they did. Every hour that project remained shut down was costing money. Serious money. Crews still had to be paid. Equipment rentals were still active. Schedules were collapsing. Investors were asking questions. The machine had stopped moving. And when a machine that size stops moving, people get nervous. Nathan glanced toward my side yard. "We'll remove all materials from your property." I followed his gaze. The lumber was still there. The steel was still there. The damage was still there. Then I looked back at him. "That's not enough." For the first time, the smile slipped. "Just a little." "What do you mean?" I stepped off the porch and motioned toward the grass. Or what used to be grass. The ground looked like a parking lot. Compacted soil. Deep tire marks. Debris scattered everywhere. "You didn't just store materials here," I said. "You used the property." Nathan nodded slowly. "We understand that." "No, irraplia." "I don't think you do." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I laid out exactly what I wanted. Full restoration. Fresh topsoil. Removal of all debris. New grass. Repair of damaged sections. And a physical barrier along the property line to prevent it from happening again. Nathan listened quietly. No arguments. No interruptions. Just listening. Because at that point he understood something important. The conversation wasn't really happening on my porch. The conversation was happening behind him at that silent construction site. The stop work order was doing all the talking. Finally, he exhaled and said 2 words. "Fair enough." That was it. No fight. No negotiation. No threats. Just acceptance. Because leverage changes conversations. 2 days later, the removal crews arrived. Watching them work was strangely satisfying. Not because I enjoyed seeing people clean up a mess. Because every truckload leaving my property represented accountability. The lumber disappeared. The steel disappeared. The pallets disappeared. One by one, everything that never should have been there was gone. Then came the restoration crews. Workers broke apart the compacted soil. Fresh topsoil was delivered. The ground was graded and leveled. Debris was removed. Grass seed was spread across every damaged section. For nearly a week, they worked carefully, methodically, correcting damage that had taken only days to create. And eventually a temporary fence appeared along the property line. Simple, visible, impossible to misunderstand. The funny thing is that fence wasn't really there to define a boundary. The boundary had always been clear. The fence existed because somebody finally understood that ignoring the boundary had consequences. A few weeks later, county inspectors returned. They walked the site, reviewed the repairs. compared everything against the complaint. And this time they found no violations. The stop work order was lifted. Construction resumed. The trucks came back. The workers came back. The noise came back. But something was different now. Every vehicle stayed exactly where it belonged. Every material stack remained inside the approved area. Nobody crossed the line. Not once. Fast forward several months. The townhomes were eventually completed. Fresh paint, landscaping, prospective renters touring the property every weekend. Most people driving by would never know what happened there. To them, it was just another successful development, another finished project, another new addition to the neighborhood. And honestly, that's fine, because my goal was never to destroy the project. It was never revenge. It was never about winning. I simply wanted respect for something that belonged to me. My side yard today looks almost exactly the way it did before all of this started. Open, green, quiet. Sometimes I'll sit on the back patio with a cup of coffee and look across that stretch of grass. And every now and then, I think about how easily the whole situation could have gone differently. Because the truth is, the first stack of lumber wasn't really the problem. The first forklift wasn't the problem. The real problem was the assumption behind them. The assumption that nobody would push back, that nobody would notice, that nobody would care. And that's a lesson that reaches far beyond construction sites. You see it in businesses, neighborhoods, friendships, families. People test boundaries, sometimes intentionally, sometimes without even realizing it. They take a step, then another, and if nobody responds, they start believing the space belongs to them. Not because they earned it, because it was left unchallenged. What happened to me taught me something I'll probably carry for the rest of my life. Boundaries don't enforce themselves. Rules don't defend themselves. Rights don't protect themselves. People do. And the strongest response usually isn't the loudest one. It's the calmest, the most patient, the most prepared. Because anger might make you feel powerful for a moment, but evidence changes outcomes. Now here's where I'd love to hear your opinion. If you were in my position, would you have reported the project when the first materials appeared on your land? Or would you have waited and documented everything like I did? Do you think the company deserved the stop work order? Or should I have handled it privately before involving the county? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always split people right down the middle. And if you've ever dealt with neighbors, contractors, developers, or anyone who thought your boundaries didn't matter, share your experience too. I'm curious where you draw the line when someone crosses yours.